Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us for our last installment of our program series for the NEH grant, the National Endowment for the Humanities grant that we received earlier this year that focuses on the question of, or the scenario of Georgia's response to desegregation. And so this presentation is going to be a summary of the last two classes that were presented by my colleague Penny Cliff in the back. And it's going to cover resistance and activism, steps toward integration. And so with this project, we have explored various collections. We ultimately decided upon the focus of education simply because we had a plethora of materials, original materials on education, but we also realized that desegregation was such a huge topic that there was going to be so much more than we could cover in our classes. And even today in this class, there's a lot to cover in a short time to do it because Penny did such a wonderful job in pulling together her last two classes. And so my job is to kind of condense 4 hours into one. So it was not an easy task this time, but one of the things I wanted to highlight was some of the images that and some other records from some collections that we may not really focus on due to time and the focus on education. But the thing about desegregation was it touched every facet of life. There was a lot going on during this time. And so one facet is public transportation, and we have in the archives the MARTA records, the Atlanta Transit System, as it was then called. And so this image shows some African-American passengers boarding at the rear of the bus. And this is a similar image. I'm guessing they both were taken it on the same day. And you can see it's a closer look. But one of the recent finds, and I was really excited when we found this one, was this decal included in the MARTA records that thankfully we scanned it and we now see like a regular image, but it's actually a mirror image, the original, so you have to read it backwards. And so essentially it's a decal that they would have used on one of the buses to add that signage to let people know that the white passengers board from the front and the colored passengers board from the rear, or seat from the front, and the colored passengers seat from the rear. In addition to that, there was some progress, or there was some changes being made, of course, because with the rulings with the bus boycott in Montgomery, as well as the board Brown versus Board of Education, which is what we're going to talk about later, there was a lot of movement to desegregate everything, including public transportation. And so what you see here are letters from that collection, where on the left, there's a letter coming from a Mr. Edward Cahill, who's a part of the Greater Atlanta Council for Human Relations, who was writing to Robert Somerville, who was the current president at the time of the Atlanta Transit Company, or transit system. And he was asking questions about what was the progress update on them removing the signs from the buses. And so in this letter, it was interesting to read that they wanted to make sure that, this wasn't a situation or a scenario that was left on question, but the response was one that was very interesting as well. And so Mr. Somerville responded that the signs on the vehicles have been progressively removed since last year, and all new vehicles put into service will not have carried those signs. In addition to that, down here, this last paragraph was one that I kind of smiled when I read it. He simply said, as a supporter, financially and otherwise, of the Greater Atlanta Council on Human Relations, your letter disturbs me. With so much needing to be done and thought about in this particular area, I'm dismayed that you have time for this trivial complaint. It is not as though the matter has been overlooked. The most cursory examination would reveal that a large proportion of our fleet no longer carry the sign, and it must be obvious that our prime duty is to run these vehicles to carry our passengers and not have them sitting around in paint shops, except as they can be handled on an ordinary routine basis. So that was an example of progress, well, checks and balances to a certain extent, of progress being made in terms of desegregating the bus system, in terms of actually removing the signs from the buses. And so the following year, another letter went out, this time from a Mrs. Eliza Pascal, who is now the chairman of that same council. And she wanted to, follow up. And they wanted to know when will all the signs be gone? So at this point, this is May 1961. The previous letter was actually literally a year prior. And so this is his response. So the answer to your letter about seating signs in our buses is that they are gradually being eliminated. At the last count, we had some 250 vehicles without the signs, including all the new vehicles. I have no idea at this time when the last of the signs will go. And of course, this last paragraph is also interesting. I do not share your fear that anyone does not know about desegregation. In addition, considering the widespread way in which other signs in our buses are ignored, I'm really surprised that anyone should be paying attention to that particular sign in those vehicles which still have it. So anyone who works in public areas know that sometimes signs are invisible to those who need to see them. And I thought it was funny that he made that point of saying that. But this just goes to show that desegregation was happening on a multitude of fronts with various agencies. And so in our last class, we talked about, we started actually with Plessy versus Ferguson, which was the case that created or started the separate but equal idea. Now we're going to start with Brown versus Board of Education to a certain extent, because Brown essentially overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, where it declared that separate was not equal. The Minimum Foundation Fund was something that was started by Governor Herman Talmadge, who was a staunch segregationist. And he came up with this idea that led to the school equalization program, where he appealed to the masses and basically told them to avoid quote unquote integration / race mixing. It was necessary to have a 3% sales tax so that you could pay for the schools, so that the schools will be equal, but still separate. And so during this time, there was huge growth. African-American schools that were in poor condition, they were replaced with newer, modern buildings and facilities that had running water, that had toilets and everything. And so that was one step that they tried to take, or they actually took, to discourage integration. But because of the way in which things were going on a national level, they started to anticipate the call for desegregation. And so Governor Talmadge anticipated this. He talked about how under his tutelage in office that the Negro race had made the greatest advancement in history in this state. The teacher's salary were completely equalized, which of course we know that's not true. And once the present 200 million school construction program is complete, facilities too will be equalized. So they are really pushing all of these points, including And this other part over here, where it states that for the first time in history, the state's 3 senior Negro colleges are fully accredited, and the state is granting scholarships to the nation's best universities to those colored students who wish to pursue courses of studies not offered for them in Georgia. So they were working very hard to create a system so that they would not want to integrate schools. So education in 1954, they transitioned from 11th to 12th grade, so they added another grade. The cost per student was roughly $190 for white students and $130 for Black students. So does that seem equal at all? And they improved the schools, and they replaced the older, inadequate buildings. So this map shows what the status was in terms of segregated schools in the US. The red, primarily South, primarily slaveholding states, historically slaveholding states, well, some of them are red. All the schools were it was required. Because if you remember in our previous classes, well, one of the first things we learned was in 1870, when the school system was established in the state of Georgia, it was established as a separate school system, separate by race. So the students, the white and colored students, will be taught separately. So when the schools were established, they were already segregated. And so this map actually brings it all together and kind of gives a more visual of what it was like for school children during that time, when for me as a student who grew up in the South, I thought everybody's school was segregated. But of course, that's not the case. And we can see that with this map. This right here is a listing of the governors that served during those years. Of course, you see Talmadge, Griffin, and Vanderveer, all of which were staunch segregationists. And as you can see from the quotes on the left, Talmadge basically said, as long as I'm your governor, Negroes will not be admitted to white schools in Georgia. He fought it tooth and nail. Marvin Griffin, running for the governor in 1954, social equality is impossible. The schools are not going to be mixed come hell or high water. Hell or high water. And literally, they worked very hard at that. So what we want to do right now is we want to pause to kind of look at this video that gives you a better understanding or introduction to Brown versus the Board of Education.
On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. The court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. This decision grew out of several cases that challenged racial segregation in schools across America. Because the lawsuits addressed the same legal questions, the Supreme Court consolidated them into one case. Its lead plaintiff was Oliver Brown. He sued the Topeka, Kansas Board of Education on behalf of his daughter, Linda. She was a Black public school student who lived just a few blocks from an elementary school in Topeka. However, she was forced to travel over an hour to reach the all-Black school she was assigned to attend. When she tried to enroll in the closer neighborhood school, which was all white, the request was denied. In the U.S. Supreme Court, Brown was represented by NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall. He argued that segregated schools were harmful and left Black children with feelings of inferiority. The court unanimously decided in Brown's favor, declaring that separate educational facilities were, without exception, unequal. Chief Justice Earl Warren declared that, quote, in the field of public education, The doctrine of separate but equal has no place. And while it didn't happen immediately, this ruling paved the way for integration and was a major victory for the civil rights movement.
So Brown versus Board of Education was one of the cornerstones of the civil rights movement, as was mentioned in the video. And it helped establish the precedent that separate but equal in education and other services were not, in fact, equal at all. The thing about desegregation was many people spoke out about it. Whites, African Americans, people from various backgrounds. And the thing about the activism during this time was there was a lot at stake. We have heard about some of the acts of violence against those who were activists, like bombings of houses. We heard about the bombing in 1963 with the church bombing in Birmingham. I'm about to call it Birmingham, but it was Birmingham. And so for ministers, and I'm thinking these are actually white churches, to speak out against segregation. A lot of times in these news articles, they included identifying information about the individuals who spoke out. So in the case of these ministers, their churches were listed. And this was a time when there was a lot of activity, both good and bad, going on. And so for them to put their names and their churches in the newspaper, or to just have this declaration, they were putting not only themselves, but also their churches in danger. But of course, there were many who thought that integration should stand, and we'll see several slides about this. But this one was one that was interesting, especially this quote down here, where it talks about the Supreme Court ruling against segregation in schools in the minds of thinking white and colored Georgians alike. I'm sorry. Against segregation in schools was an unwise decision in the minds of thinking white and colored Georgians alike. But even so, it was taken calmly and without incident in the South, which in itself is an indication of good race relations. Left alone, the South could solve its own race relation problems, but the Supreme Court has handed down this anti-segregation ruling at several generations too early. We believe the Supreme Court justices felt the ruling was aimed at the heart of the South. What they probably haven't realized yet is the fact that more race problems exist north of the Mason-Dixie line than south. So it's interesting to read those thoughts, because this part right here really is striking for me, where it says them in the minds of thinking white and colored Georgians alike. So are they saying that the other people aren't thinking? Not only was there the resistance in terms of the population of the public, they actually codified a lot of this stuff in law. So Senate Bill number 40, passed in 1955. The Board of Brown versus Board of Education was 1954. So in 55, they passed a law that basically said that any school that desegregated would not receive public funds. So think about that. Schools run on public funds. So if they don't receive those funds, technically they can't run. So even if there was a school system that wanted to desegregate, they would be breaking the law if they decided to do that. So of course we mentioned Marvin Griffin, who was a pro-segregationist governor, and he vowed to preserve segregation. So there was an open letter to the governor, and in this one, they continue to speak out against the justices. Judging by your utterances so far, it seems you have overlooked or underestimated the main saving fact of the situation, which the Supreme Court does not understand. That fact is that our Negro citizens, like white citizens, do not want integration into public schools. If given half a chance, they will continue to conform with our ancient custom of segregation. Over and above so-called Jim Crow laws, some of which are outworn, there has come into being in our South a natural segregation of races, springing from the desire of the members of each race to associate with their own kind. The white and Negro races in Georgia have many bonds with each other, but each other has peculiarities of manner and custom, habit and thought that the other does not share. So if left to their own devices, they would say, oh, we have harmony between the races. And we all know, knowing a little bit about history, that is truly not the case. So there was a follow-up to the Brown versus the Board of Education in 1955, when they realized that the South was going to drag its feet, kicking and screaming. Remember the hell or high water comment? So in Brown 2, they declared that it happened with all deliberate speed. This was 1955. So we will see what they did in response to that, which was they passed a resolution, an interposition resolution, where they talked about the Supreme Court decisions, both Brown 1, 1954, and Brown 2 in 1955. And they're saying that all similar decisions by the Supreme Court, null, void, and of no effect, to declare that a contest of powers has arisen between the state of Georgia and the Supreme Court of the United States to invoke the doctrine of interposition and for other purposes. So essentially what they declared was Brown versus the Board of Education would not have any effect on the state of Georgia. And so ultimately, these are some of the things that the state of Georgia did in response to Brown versus the Board of Education. 1954, they passed the private school plan that authorized payment of tuition grants to parents of students who wanted to spend in private schools of their choice. They wanted to terminate state funding for desegregated schools. That law, Senate Bill 40, I think it was. They wanted to close schools or have the option to close schools and facilities and have the option to lease them to private schools. They wanted to extend teacher retirement benefits for teachers in private schools. They wanted to give the governor the authority to suspend compulsory attendance laws, because by that time they created or mandated that children had to go to school. The General Assembly provided specific punishment for any peace officer who refuses to enforce segregation. So just think about it. If you were someone who was for desegregation and you were in a position of power, essentially you could not do anything, because if you did not enforce the law, you could be penalized. They also created the Georgia Education Commission, known as the Sibley Commission, to plot ways to keep schools segregated, excuse me. Another response that they had was the Segregation Amendment. And the way they sold it was, if school segregation amendment is defeated by the people, there will be no schools of any kind in those counties and cities in which the existing schools are closed by the federal courts. And there will be no public funds available for education of the people in that county or city. If the amendment is ratified by the people, the General Assembly will be able to provide money for the education of all children, white and colored, in those counties and cities in which the federal courts destroy the existing public schools. So to kind of understand that better, basically they were between a rock and a hard place. So the people were being told that if you don't support this amendment, they're going to close the schools. If you support it, they can keep them open. And so the history of Georgia was that early on, one of the first events that happened in UGA was a cocking affair, where there was some interference by the governor with the University of Georgia, where it was rumored that a professor wanted to encourage integration. And that made it all the way up to the governor. They weren't having it. And so that ultimately led to the UGA and the University Schools of Georgia to lose their accreditation. So all the universities, public university and colleges in the state, lost their accreditation. And Arnold, who was the governor following, I think it was Eugene Talmadge, Arnold worked hard to get the accreditation reestablished, and also put in a law that stated that the governor could not influence the events or happenings with the Board of Regents in the university system of Georgia. And so that being fresh in some people's mind, they were like, we can't do that again. We can't lose accreditation. We can't close the schools, because what happens when you close the schools? If a person doesn't have the ability to go to private schools, then their child will go without schools. There were some states that actually did it. Virginia actually closed the schools in response to desegregation. So ultimately, the segregation amendment passed by a very slim margin. And so the interesting thing about this was that, of course, the states communicated across state line. So this is a letter from Dr. Robert L. Cousins, who's the director of the Negro Education Division here in Georgia, who wrote to the Negro Education Division director for Tennessee, and told them about the law that was ratified, the amendment that was ratified. And he says, the closeness of the vote revealed the concern of the citizens of the public school system. There is now no talk of moving toward a private school plan. So it's almost like they did that just to kind of gauge people's interests about the schools. And so there was no movement toward that public school plan. One of the superintendents, well, not one of the superintendents, the state superintendent at the time, he sent a letter to the superintendents across the state that highlighted the various bills that were passed by the General Assembly in relation to education. And of course, the first one was Senate Bill number 40, which provided that no state and local funds shall be in any manner appropriated for public schools except for schools in which the white and colored races are separately educated. And this is in 1955. So remember, Brown happened in 1954 and Brown 2 happened in May 1955. So in between those two bills, they passed the Senate bill, or it's between those two court cases, they passed the Senate bill. In addition to being under attack, the school systems, the teachers were also under attack, because if they learned that you as a Black teacher was a member of the NAACP, you would lose your job. Leaders throughout the state of Georgia have spoken out against the recent ruling of the Georgia Board of Education banning forever any teacher who is a member or is any way affiliated with the NAACP. And this was further cemented by a letter that was sent by Eugene Cook, who was the Attorney General at the time. And I blew it up on the next slide, but this is a summary of the fear, as my colleague mentioned when she presented it, that they ultimately had, because all of this is operating out of fear. But one part of this was he mentioned the reiteration about the only type of school system that the state could support and maintain was a segregated one. But also he mentioned this: the rabid representatives of the left-wing socialists inspired NAACP have frankly admitted that they are not interested in securing the best possible education for the Negro children, but rather their ultimate goal is an enforced mixing of the races, which inevitably leads to intermarriage. How does a child getting an equal education equate to a desire for intermarriage? It seems kind of out of place, but that was the fear. So, of course, 1957, that law was still on the books. The penalty was a felony. So even if you desire to desegregate your school system, not only would your school not get public funds, you could be charged with a felony. So you're risking jail time. So there were organizations such as Help Our Public Education, HOPE, who were created during this time to help fight some of these situations, especially the idea of closing the schools. And what I didn't include was there are a number of letters. The thing about our records is being that any letters sent to the governor or certain state agencies ultimately end up at the state archives. So we have gobs and gobs and gobs of letters. My colleague Penny pulled out several of them in one of her last classes where there was a table covered with nothing but telegrams of people voicing their opinion about being pro or being for or against segregation. So one of the things, in addition to creating the laws, those states, remember that map that I showed you? Those states actually talked to each other. The governors, the leadership in those states, they had conversations about what to do about this desegregation question. And they were fighting for their traditional way of life, as can be seen in this resolution here. And ultimately, they formed the Southern Manifesto. So in 1956, mind you, that's a year following Round 2, a group of Southern senators and congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto, vowing resistance to racial integration by lawful means. So 19 U.S. senators and 82 representatives from the South. Those individuals came from the congressional delegations of these states. All of them were from former Confederate states. 99 were Democrats, 2 were Republicans. So at the time, the Democratic Party isn't exactly the Democratic Party that we're thinking of right now. So at one point, they actually switched. So this is just a reminder of the map that we had before. So some of the quotes from the Southern Manifesto included them discussing the unwarranted decision of the Supreme Court in the public school cases, now bearing the fruit always produced when men substitute naked power for established law. So mind you, back in 1896, when it was found in their favor, they didn't say all this. They supported the decision. But because it is going against what they feel are their traditional customs, they are attacking the court. The original Constitution does not mention education. Neither does the 14th Amendment nor any other amendment. The debates preceding the submission of the 14th Amendment clearly show that there are no intent that it should affect the system of education maintained by the states. Unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusions in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable relations between the white and Negro races that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there has been heretofore friendship and understanding. Has there really been friendship and understanding in those 90 years? I wouldn't say so. But these are some of the individuals who signed the manifesto, and this is the button they actually wore. Never. One simple word, never. So ultimately, the approach that they came to was a moderate approach. And we're jumping ahead a little bit, but that's for a reason. Limited desegregation. So of course, we remember that Brown 2 said with all deliberate speed, that was not going to be the case. And so one of the controversies that happened during that time was the Sugar Bowl controversy. And this is an interesting one simply because it was about a football game. And so the Sugar Bowl featured Georgia Tech versus the University of Pittsburgh. The problem was in that one of the players on the University of Pittsburgh's team, Bobby Greer, was African American. And so, of course, along with everything else in the Southern life, athletics was also segregated. So, although there was a discussion had by Marvin Griffin, who had a son attending Georgia Tech at the time, who privately acquiesced to them playing the game, publicly he reversed his decision and said that he didn't want them to play. So he sent out publicly sent another telegram to his state's border regions imploring that the teams for Georgia not engage in racially integrated events which had Blacks either as participants or in the stands. It read, "The South stands at Armageddon. The battle is joined. We cannot make the slightest concession to the enemy in this dark and lamentable hour of struggle. There is no more difference in compromising integrity of race on the playing field than in doing so in the classrooms. One break in the dike and the relentless enemy will rush and destroy us." So as with anything, we know that there's one thing that's king in the South. That's football. So they don't care about race, they care about football. And we have several letters that were written to the Board of Regents about this, both for and against. This one was interesting because as an alumni of Georgia Tech and a native Georgian, they were shocked at the stance at the time on segregation in sports. He supports principles of states' rights, but there is a such thing as going too far. If you insist on continuing your present stand, I shall be forced to cast my vote in the future for someone other than you, and I shall use my influence among my friends for them to do the same. So he was threatening, as a person who had some influence, to discourage people from voting from him. As white Southerners, we would like to state that if the Board of Regents even considers complying with the demands of the governor of Georgia concerning segregation on the playing field, it would be an outrage. Not only would it be a direct affront to good sportsmanship, but would also contradict all American principles of Christianity and democracy. Athletic crowdness has never been limited to members of the Caucasian race. A few overambitious politicians have already caused the world, not just the North, to think diversively of the South. Must we be defamed in the sporting world as well? So it's interesting that they brought in Christianity, the American principles of Christianity and democracy. And they use that as justification as to why they don't agree with this. So ultimately, there was a demonstration by the students at Georgia Tech. They hung the governor in the effigy. They actually marched on the Capitol. And I think they also marched on the governor's mansion. About 2,000 students. Not only were the Georgia Tech students protesting, a few days later, students at their rival, University of Georgia, held their own protests against the governor. So these are rivals. They're still rivals today. But in this case, they supported each other. So this is an example of one of the telegrams from an alumni. And this is another example. But he's a former football player in Notre Dame who always played as best players regardless of race, creed, or color against all teams. I'm proud that you are supporting the students stand to play Pitt. So ultimately, it came down to the governor blaming Georgia Tech's president for the riot. The president, Blake Van Leer, would actually be summoned to the Board of Regents, and he ultimately said, either we're going to play the Sugar Bowl, or you can find yourself another damn president for Georgia Tech. So he made his stance. Ultimately, it was decided by the Board of Regents 13-1 to allow Georgia Tech to play in the Sugar Bowl, which they later won. And what's interesting in that, there are records from a historically black fraternity sent to the Board of Regents congratulating them on the decision that they made. I thought that was really interesting. This was a letter from the city of Atlanta's police department to the president of Georgia Tech. And this was a description of what happened. The entire group was very noisy and rather disorderly at times. There was very slight property damage reported at various places, but no one was injured. From the information that I received, I cannot say it was a riot, but a demonstration. And so there are other descriptions of what happened, and ultimately a letter from the President Van Leer to the chancellor at the time basically said that the cause of the demonstration was because of the governor's open message. And the students were demonstrating chiefly for 3 reasons. They resented having taken away from them and their team what they considered their bowl game. They were very angry about this because it was being attempted by a political officer of the state rather than their own academic and athletic authorities upon whose bodies they have representation. And third, when a small percentage of students already know, just before final examinations, when a small percentage of students already know that they're going to fail, any excuse is good enough to join in a shirt tail parade because those boys know they're going to be dismissed from school and they have nothing to lose. So it's like they're going to get flunked out of school anyway, so why not have some fun before they leave? So as I said, Georgia Tech won 7-0. That's a good question. Do you know where it was played? Yeah. Which is interesting. So they were in the South playing a ball game, an integrated ball game. So many of you are probably familiar with the KKK. And so the Citizens Council was one of the groups that were started in relation to the state's response to desegregation. Citizens Council is made up of more the public figures, the politicians, those with a lot of power. And so the states' right councils of Georgia loosely affiliated with the White Citizens Council of other southern states. And so they even had brochures with very interesting images. They had documents that show the aims and purposes, but they even had fundraising dinners. Our colleague Katie found in our collection a great deal of these newspapers with these bright red headlines. This one talks about the States' Rights Council of Georgia will hold annual fundraising dinner. And so we even have an invitation for one of the dinners where it was held, and it was $25 a plate. And these were the speakers. So Richard Russell, Governor Vandiver, and Senator Talmadge. And so, of course, the newspapers carried a lot of these interesting headlines. But by 1959, mind you, this is what, 4 and 5 years after Brown versus Board of Education, Atlanta, was ordered to, by the U.S. District Court Judge Frank Hooper to desegregate or to integrate. He, however, delayed the implementation of the order by 1 year to give authorities time to develop a desegregation plan. So by this time, we are several years past Brown 2, which said with all deliberate speed. It's been several years. That doesn't seem like deliberate speed to me. That same year, University of Georgia was desegregated. Charlene Hunter and Hamilton Holmes, they applied to attend UGA originally, but they were denied. The NAACP sued, and in 1960, UGA was ordered to admit them. They ultimately graduated in 1963, but that was not without issues. In 1961, 200 students hanged effigy on campus in protest of them being there. In addition to that, after a sports event on January the 11th, there was a planned segregationist riot where a mob will attack the dorm where Charlene lived. It took 2 hours for the patrol to get there. So as a result of this mob and this attack, the governor ordered Charlene and Hamilton removed from UGA. They were ultimately suspended from the school, but thanks to a judge, they were ordered to be reinstated, and the students were allowed to go back to school. So literally, think about it. Somebody in a court, a judge, had to order you to be reinstated to go back to school. So the courts continued working to order integration because the state wasn't doing it. Because, of course, remember the Senate Bill 40 that basically said no public funding would go to any desegregated schools. So Georgia's response, in addition to that, was the Committee on Schools, which was a Sibley Commission. And the Sibley Commission, in their report, which is available in full on our virtual vault, ultimately decided that each local district would decide how to desegregate the matter itself. So ultimately, they had to come up with desegregation plans. There is an awesome video that we're not going to see today because of time constraints, but we may go back to it, that talks about desegregation and the South's resistance. So ultimately, the commission decided that slow integration was the way to go. And the bill passed on January 31st. The Atlanta school system officially desegregated the following autumn, so that fall. So 1961, this is now 7 years after Brown versus the Board of Education, where the desegregation of the Atlanta school system began. And so they ultimately became known as the Atlanta Nine, but on August 30th, 1961, 9 students, one of which many of us know, Madeline Nix, went on to integrate high schools around Atlanta. This shows a listing of what students went to what school. And I thought that to discuss this, it would be a good idea just to hear it from them. And we're going to listen to a portion of this video.
On August 30th, 1961, 9 students systematically changed the Atlanta public school system and the city of Atlanta forever. The result of their courage and active engagement was the integration of 4 of Atlanta's all-white high schools. In 1958, then Governor Ernest Vanderbilt, as did his predecessors, promised to maintain segregation in the state's public schools. In 1959, a federal court ordered Atlanta's segregated public school system to integrate immediately. There was a massive resistance, along with the threat to shut down the schools rather than integrate. Citizen groups advocated finding ways to desegregate so that public schools could stay open. A report from the governor's office allowed for minimal integration within the Supreme Court's decision. 133 African American students applied to transfer. 10 were accepted, but only 9 were allowed to transfer. On October 17, 2011, the Atlanta Board of Education honored 3 of the students to commemorate the 50th anniversary of school integration.
I do not consider myself a trailblazer. I consider myself someone who happened to have been at the right place at the right time and was blessed to be one of the individuals selected to attend. I didn't perceive the integration of the Atlanta public school as being integration so much as desegregation, because so few of us were allowed to go, and because of the process that we went through in order to be selected. So I was just blessed to be able to take exams very well.
In 1961, in a phenomenon that people have written lots of books about. The civil rights movement was just getting underway in full force. And quite frankly, my attitude was it was my task to take this on. There were other people who were doing other things. There were people who were, in fact, integrating the interstate carriers. They were doing the freedom rides. There were people who were sitting down at lunch counters. There were other people who, in fact, were integrating the state college system. Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter were 2 students who were integrating the University of Georgia the same year that we, the 9 of us, were integrating the Atlanta public schools. And so it was just part of what was going on, and this was a role that I could play. So I did not consider myself a trailblazer, just part of the team, really.
Do you consider yourself?
So I like what he said there. He considered himself a part of a team, because the thing about resistance and activism is that people did what they could. We learned in one of the first classes that when it came time to support the schools, the community, the African American community, even with its limited resources, was the one that raised the most money, because education for them was that important. So just like he said, you know, many people played a role. Many people did what they could to do a form of activism. They integrated schools. They supported people. They supported the NAACP. They did the sit-ins. They were on the buses. They were marching. They were risking their lives. So there's so many countless stories about the activism that happened during that time. Like I said, there was a lot going on. You can have a whole class, 2 semesters of classes just discussing the civil rights movement and what was going on in the 1950s and 60s. And so ultimately, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 took place, and integration was very slow in the South. However, the Civil Rights Act actually helped to make it happen a little faster. So this law gave Congress the power to outlaw segregation in most public places and gave minorities equal access to facilities such as restaurants and theaters. So remember, we started this conversation talking about MARTA, removing the signage from the buses. And so that was in 1960, 1961. By 1964, the entire US got a swift kick in the butt saying, hey, we need to get this done, because that, with all deliberate speed, was not happening. So with that, we now see 2 years after the passing of the Civil Rights Bill in 1966, the desegregation plans. And what's funny is that these are two separate plans from two separate counties. The one on the right is Cobb County. The one on the left is Bryan County. They're dated basically the same date. And if you look at them, and I'm sorry for dragging it so quickly, they read exactly the same. So it's like they each came up with, they worked and came up with this boilerplate. And the plan required each student or his parent to choose the school the student will attend in the coming year. It does not matter which school the student is attending this year, and it does not matter whether the school was formerly a white or Negro school. You and your child must select any school you wish. So nearly 12 years following the Board of Education, there now is a plan. And this is the desegregation plan for Bryan County Schools. And this is the choice, the form, where the students and the parents had to provide, selecting the school that they were planning to attend. And this is a picture from roughly the 1960s, a school possibly in Marietta of an integrated classroom. Our colleague Katie pulled together this timeline that kind of gives a snapshot of some of the big events that was happening during that time frame. And we plan to use this in some additional materials that we're planning to develop for this grant. But I thought that this was a really great way to end, to kind of give you a summary of the different events that took place. With that being said, just wanted to thank the entire Georgia Archives team for all of their hard work and continued support for this effort, especially Penny Cliff, who took the lead on this project and has been a good leader, has kept us on task, kept us focused, and we have done as we were asked to do. So are there any questions? If there are no questions, I want to actually end and go back to this other slide, because I thought that this was a good one, because in addition to transportation and education and everything else, there was also another fight that was happening in relation to desegregation. That was a part of the resistance. Sorry for that. Sorry for the ads. I didn't have this one queued up because I didn't think we would have enough time. But I think this will be a great way to end this class. Sorry.
In 1954,
The Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that segregation was inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. And it was about schools. But everyone knew that what it really was about was that the whole system of segregation included voting, included public accommodations, included every aspect of life. That whole system of segregation that the South had established was now considered unlawful, unconstitutional. And that was a day which essentially meant that Plessy versus Ferguson, handed down almost 60 years earlier than Brown, 60 years of Jim Crow, of blatant segregation, was declared unconstitutional. Now there was going to be no longer separate and unequal. But the real problem was how to make the South live by that decision. All the southern states began to figure out how they could resist the war. How could they overturn the war? In Georgia, there was an immediate response. By 1956, the Georgia legislature passed several laws, including one which changed the Georgia flag and put the old Confederate flag into the state flag. Now, some have claimed that that was simply an act of celebrating the history. In truth, anyone can clearly see that it was enmeshed in the whole business of massive resistance against Brown versus the Board. The legislature in that session, when they passed the change in the flag, also passed laws getting ready to dismantle public education. They passed a law that would allow public schools' retirement funds to be transferred to private schools. They passed legislation to allow public schools to lease to private schools, which did not have to follow Brown, their equipment and their buildings. 1956 legislature primarily did nothing but get ready to establish the mechanisms by which to resist Brown versus the Board of Education. By 1959, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had challenged the resistance to segregation in the courts and had gotten a federal court order from Judge Frank Hooper that the Atlanta schools would have to be desegregated. Immediately, the Governor Vanderveer, he set up a commission which was to study what to do, how to resist, and how to handle this fact of a federal court order ordering a specific integration of the first schools in Georgia. Governor Vanderveer appointed a lawyer and a businessman by the name of John Sibley as chair of this commission that was to study the question. The Sibley Commission prepared a report and that essentially said that we should not close the public schools of Georgia to avoid integration. And it listed a dozen ways in which to frustrate integration. So as a result, the Sibley Commission's recommendations were used to assure that desegregation would occur very slowly across Georgia. It gave Georgia state officials a lot of suggestions about how to frustrate the desegregation process, how to slow it down, how to assure that if it occurred at all, it would occur very slowly with many delays. And one of those techniques was the notion of simply saying that we will admit a token number of African-American students and arguing that that was desegregation because it ended segregation. There were other techniques as well, but the Sibley Commission's report essentially was the blueprint that assured that desegregation of our schools in Georgia would occur one at a time, very slowly over a period of several years.
All right. So we have any questions?
Ever wonder why Lidl prices their charcuterie so low?
Have any questions? All right, with that being said, I just want to say thank you for spending part of your day with us today. And this session will be posted on our YouTube channel, as well as other sessions ultimately in the future with relation to the classes that were taught previously. So we're working, we being Royal, Penny is working to put those up online as well as the other two presentations. So that being said, thank you so much.